game of the season against an opponent from...
When you hear the word cheerleader, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Is it mean?
Brad, you've been waiting for me since 9th grade. 2 months won't kill you.
Pretty?
I'm bitchin', great hair. The boys all love to stare.
Or maybe it's dumb.
I love the smell of hairspray in the morning.
Careful. I hear helping hairspray bakes the brain.
Impossible. I use it all the time.
These are some of the many stereotypes that American pop culture has created for cheerleaders over the last few decades. But cheerleaders' roles as athletes, performers, marketers, and crowd inspirers is often overlooked in contemporary media in favor of these more reductive terms that emphasize beauty and social status over everything else. So how did we get here? Let's go back to the late 1800s. The beginnings of American cheerleading go hand in hand with the beginnings of intercollegiate athletics. On November 6, 1869, Princeton University faced Rutgers in what is now recognized as the first intercollegiate football game, hosting around 100 spectators. While the game itself was a big step for collegiate athletics, the spectators also played an important role in the development of cheerleading. At its inception, American cheerleading was extremely informal. It started out as one man stepping out from the crowd at a football game, encouraging fans to cheer together. By the 1890s, this man became known as the Yell Leader or the Yell King, separating the cheerleader from the fan section. The Yell King was often chosen based on popularity, which planted the seeds of cheerleading representing social success and influence. Universities began to pick up on the role of cheerleaders in cultivating school spirit and a culture around athletics. According to a New York Times article from 1924, Stanford University began incorporating cheerleading-related classes to its curriculum, such as bleacher psychology, correct use of the voice, and the development of stage presence. So by the 1920s, cheerleaders were beginning to be recognized as integral to the athletic experience, and moreover, became more selective. Cheerleading squads became exclusive, holding tryouts based on agility, tumbling, and stunting skills. Once women became introduced to cheerleading by 1930, cheerleading became less about physical ability and manliness, and transitioned into an activity for pretty, socially elite, and white women, which we might know today as the stereotypical American cheerleader. By the early 1960s, cheerleading experienced significant changes because many of its key dichotomies came to the surface due to the standardization of white cheerleading style. Cheerleading had spread into lower education by the 1950s, becoming an activity in elementary and junior high schools. This was sparked by the formation of the National Cheerleaders Association, or the NCA, in 1948, which standardized cheerleading instruction to children and coaches and provided camps and clinics to formalize technique and content. Though cheerleading became a nationally organized activity with training and coaching characteristic of a sport, it still hadn't been referred to as a sport. Cheerleading's tension between being a sport requiring athleticism and a performance-based activity raised some key questions in the 1950s. Is cheerleading about rousing the crowd or about putting on a show? Is it a marketing tactic using female beauty or a sport requiring dedication and practice? But American cheerleading arguably experienced its most significant changes with the integration of African Americans into previously white cheerleading programs. Before we get into integration, let's look at how African American culture influenced the practice of cheerleading, creating a distinct style of its own. African American styles of dance, tracing back to slavery, vaudevilles, and minstrel shows, have influenced cheerleading in their emphasis on stomping, clapping, and moving the hips. In 1933, Zora Neale Hurston wrote a sketch about a football game called 40 Yards, and in the stage directions, she writes, "The cheerleaders are violently gyrating to whip up the mob." In contrast to white styles of cheer that mandated a strong core and sharp motions, African American styles of dance made use of the hips, which calls on the history of tough dancing and juke joints in the late 19th century. Tough dancing was a style that hinged on the freedom of movement and ownership of the body associated with emancipation, and as ragtime dancing grew into the 1900s, it became a central aspect of American youth culture. In addition, tap dancing and stomping were central to the development of an African American style of cheer. The syncopation of ragtime music at juke joints prompted stomping, clapping, and other forms of creating percussion sounds with the body. It became evident that this style of dance had significant influence on American cheerleading when Lou Lillard, an African American cheerleader at Purdue University, noted the differences between black and white styles of cheerleading in a 1972 interview. He said, "The type of cheerleading at black high schools is more of a stomp, clap, soul swing thing. But at white schools, the traditional cheers are straight arm motions." So, understanding how different black and white styles of cheer were on their own, How did high school athletic programs, specifically cheerleading teams, respond to integration in the 1960s? Racial segregation was declared unconstitutional by Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka in 1954, and the Civil Rights Act, which passed 10 years later, banned discrimination in federally funded programs. Both of these legal developments contributed to the integration of public high schools, but they also led to a lot of backlash when tryout-based sports teams did not respond to the racially diverse talent pool. Many students voiced their opinions on integration through physical protests, from walkouts to boycotts. In a lot of these protests, other sports teams expressed solidarity for racially exclusive cheerleading squads, such as Madison Senior High School in 1967, when 17 black football players boycotted practice in protest of the cheerleading team having only selected one black cheerleader. Once more high schools were integrated by the 1970s, there were still tensions within cheerleading teams. While the integration of black and white cheerleading styles was seen as a win because it brought new styles of movement and voice into an activity created by white men and women, black styles of cheer and dance also changed with the introduction of white students into previously all-black high schools. In a 1976 newspaper article called The Rob Laws, the author expresses discontent with the integration of white students on a previously all-black cheerleading squad because it changed the style of their cheers. He says, "The bottom line is that all this puts a lot more emphasis on conformity and rigidity rather than on creativity and imagination." By calling the NCAA standardized white style of cheer conformist, the author is essentially arguing that the black style of cheer is culturally significant, whereas the white style of cheer doesn't carry the same meaning. But though this was the case, American cheerleading responded to the integration of black styles of cheer and dance, and so did contemporary pop culture. Some TV shows, like Here's Lucy and The Brady Bunch, upheld the stereotypes of white cheerleaders before integration well into the 60s and 70s.
Oh, yeah. Here's one. A Rudy to two. We are the kids of the Institute. We are not rough, we are not tough, but we are determined. Is that so hard to believe?
Well, a mother's a mother, not a cheerleader.
Well, I was. And I was a darn good one, too. In fact, I was voted Miss Cheerleader of 1930.
But films about American cheerleading from the 70s onward were a lot more complex in how they dealt with the new image of the American cheerleader. Some films call out the negative stereotypes and actively subvert them, like The Swinging Cheerleaders, in which the main character is a journalist looking to join the cheerleading team as the, quote, most exploited, demeaning activity on campus. When the star football player tries to pick her up at one point, assuming that she'll have sex with him, she tells him that she chooses her own sexual partners, much to his surprise. Other films illustrate the changes that came from the civil rights movement and the integration of black styles of cheer and dance into American cheerleading, such as in the film Revenge of the Cheerleaders. And finally, at the turn of the 21st century, the first movie in the Bring It On franchise highlights the differences between black and white styles of cheer that were prominent before integration, from high voices and little hip movement to deep voices and bent limbs. By analyzing how contemporary pop culture has represented American cheerleading today versus how it has in the past, it becomes clear that without the integration of African American styles of dance and movement, American cheerleading would not be the way we know it today. American cheerleading went from the standardized content imposed by the NCAA in the 1950s, which was essentially a white style of cheering, to varying widely across the country. Today, cheerleading teams vary from being sideline teams, competitive stunt teams, and pom teams. Moreover, cheerleading today prizes innovation and new styles of cheers, dancing, and stunting, contributing to the variety of styles in high schools, colleges, and all-star programs. American cheerleading, therefore, experienced its most significant changes during the 1950s and 60s, specifically with the integration of African American students into previously white schools and sports teams. Though an often overlooked sport, American cheerleading as a whole demonstrates the intersectionality of social movements, as integration and feminism went hand in hand in reshaping the sport and what it meant to be a female athlete in America.